Hello, and welcome to the Planter Podcast, where we talk about how to grow your own food and gardening and all that stuff. I am Peter Keefe, and I'm one of your hosts.
I'm Erin. I'm a market gardener from Huron County, Ontario, Canada.
I'm Mylan Turner, an urban gardener here in Atlanta, Georgia.
I forgot to mention I'm in Connecticut in New England. So, yeah, and today we got a very special podcast because we got our first question of the day. We ask this every week for you to send us your questions. And if you want to, ask us a question. Send it at question@planter.garden. But today, we are talking about this question from Roberta. She says, I have started a container garden in food grade tote bins so I get optimal space. I'd like to ask your advice on my process. So, let's give some advice. So yeah, starting off. I guess what are some good containers to grow in is probably where we should start.
Yeah, I really like Roberta's choice of the food grade tote bins. That's a smart choice for a few reasons. So, definitely getting a good amount of space in there. I think one of the key mistakes when choosing a container is choosing a container that's too small. And then it can dry out quickly and the plant doesn't have enough room to spread and grow. So those totes sound like they would have a good amount of space. They may not be UV treated or UV resistant. So they might break down. And a lot of plastic containers do break down over time. But that's just one thing to keep in mind. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but drainage could be a challenge in the tote bins. So you'll have to think about, putting in some drainage holes and how to manage that. But that's a great choice. It's definitely good to repurpose if you can. I've also seen 5-gallon buckets are a really,
Yep,
really popular choice for
I've seen
growing,
that.
very economical. Again, a good amount of space. Obviously your grow bags, those are, more and more popular nowadays. So there's lots of different options.
Especially if you stay with the same system for all of your containers, then you can make it like kind of modular and like add one here and there. Like that's why the 5-gallon buckets, or if you have a whole bunch of the same tote bins, would work really well. A good friend of mine grows half in raised beds and then half in 5-gallon buckets, and uh, it's really cool how they just have like all these lined up in about like probably 2 buckets wide, and then however many long, and then they sometimes even have a trellis going across, just like you would with a raised bed, but they're in reusable 5-gallon buckets. Yeah.
I'd also add, if you have the option, self-watering containers have worked really, really well for me. And we'll talk about irrigation kind of as we go, but like Peter mentioned, something that's modular, something that's consistent. I started off with self-watering containers that are about the size of the containers that the listener mentioned. And those are ones that I come back to repeatedly.
Mhm.
Now she does mention in a follow-up email that she uses black containers, which could absorb some of the sunlight. You got to take that into consideration, but I don't think it's really a deal breaker. You can work around that. You might have to water a little bit more. If you're in a really hot climate, like Mylan's climate, you might want to think about that twice and get some other color. Um, but I think it'll be fine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
the
I
ones
think
that I've used are darker in color. I've got some that are black. I've got some that are dark brown. I don't see a huge, huge difference. When we get to our hot parts of the year, everything's hot. So
Yeah.
I don't know that it makes a big difference.
Mhm. And I was going to say, I think um, even more so than overheating, again, it kind of comes down to the size of the container. So if it's a black container and it's a little bit on the small side for that plant, two things can happen. So one is the roots are really kind of around the outside of that container. So they're really touching the heat and there's nowhere for them to really escape. Whereas in a larger container, the mass in the middle might stay a bit cooler than the outside edges. And then again, it comes down to the water management, I think, is the biggest issue. So if your container is getting really hot, the soil's drying out even more quickly, which is probably, I think, one of the biggest challenges with the container growing. And that's why, Mylan, it makes sense the self-watering containers are so popular. Even larger size containers, they could need watering up to a couple times a day in the heat. It's not like growing in ground or in a large raised bed where there's a lot more soil to hold in the moisture and you can kind of protect it and keep those plants hanging on. In a container, that moisture can evaporate very quickly, even if you do put some mulch on top. So so that's one of the things you really need to think about with the container gardening is how are you going to manage that moisture?
Speaking of that, one thing that we kind of skipped before we got into talking about the containers, but what's really going to make or break it for you is your soil that you're putting in your containers. You 100% need something that is made or blended for containers. That was the first big mistake that I made in my gardening journey. I added, I was looking at the bags and I knew that I was looking for potting mix, right? But I hadn't learned to read all the fine details yet on the bags of soils. And I ended up with one that was very similar to potting mix, but it was garden soil. And I
So
got
it's like
home.
a raised bed mix also.
It was
I
a
see
raised
people make
bed mix.
that
That's
mistake a lot.
exactly what it was. That is
Yeah.
exactly what it was. And it was right next to the container mix. And I was looking for the bigger bag. So I got home, opened it up, and as soon as I touched it, and what you'll notice in the difference is the traditional potting mix container mixes, they'll be a bit finer. They won't have the big chunks that a raised bed mix will have. And the reason that those are different, because the surface area, the gardening area is bigger in a raised bed, you can have those chunks because there's more volume. And so those chunks and bark and stuff like that can retain moisture. In a container, you're going to want either coco coir or my brain is peat moss. Peat moss. There are also other peat-free solutions that are coming out, but you're going to want one of those three as the primary component. From there, you're going to want something that I'd recommend something. Well, they're all going to have perlite in them because that helps with drainage, but I would also look for something that has vermiculite or add vermiculite, horticultural grade if you can find it, because that helps with moisture retention. So something that helps with drainage, something that helps with moisture retention, and then that primary component will go a long way to fighting the irrigation issues, the heat issues that you are going to have in a container.
And the
For sure.
perlite has the added benefit of making it a little bit lighter weight too. So if you need to move the containers around, if halfway through the season the sun is starting to get shaded out by a tree or something, you can move them. Good to think about too. So
yeah, and definitely, I mean, going back even a step further, a lot of times in the beginning when you're new to gardening, you think, well, can't I just use my garden soil in my containers? Like, why wouldn't that work, right? But again, to Mylan's point, you really need that optimization of moisture retention and drainage. And if you just shovel your garden soil into a container, if it's clay soil, it's just going to be like a brick. And when it dries out, it's just going to solidify and it's not going to do well in the container. If it's in your garden, there's lots of things you can do to aerate and amend and that sort of thing. But when you shovel a bunch of clay into a container, it's just not going to work. Trust me. It's just, you really do have to get the potting mix and get the right stuff for the container to have success. And likewise with the sand is just too free draining and it won't hold any nutrients at all, which is another big challenge with the containers, along with the moisture and the drainage, is getting the plants the nutrients they need. So again, it's a confined space, so the roots can only go so far to look for nutrients. And as the water drains in and out, it can leach nutrients with it as well. So again, just another thing you really have to, because it's an enclosed ecosystem, you really have to balance it, quite particularly.
Yeah. So do either of you ever grow in containers? Like what's your current container growing situation right now?
For sure. So even though I have a market garden, I still always have some containers of plants on the go, and that's for a variety of reasons. So one is convenience. So I like to have things on my deck, especially herbs. So you can just run out and grab them. You don't have to march your way out to Timbuktu to get a little bit of basil or parsley. So that's really, really handy. Another thing is for experiments. So if it's something I don't want to try on a big scale and take up a lot of space, container growing is great just for trying a little bits of things and seeing how they do. And then also for fun plants that love to creep and take over your garden, like your mints and your oregano and all those badly behaved plants where if you put them in your garden, you will never, ever, ever get rid of them. So I grow a lot of catnip. We have 4 cats. So I always have a bunch of containers of catnip on the go just to, keep it tame and in one spot. So there's a place for containers in just about every garden, I would say.
Oh yeah. I just got
I agree.
Three new kittens. So I'm excited to see what they think about the catnip that's growing in on the green stalk and on my deck. So that's the container that I use. Is I have 3 green stalks, which is basically a very fancy container that lets you grow about 5 foot high. So yeah, but I also grow in little grow bags too. But drying out the soil in grow bags is the main problem with that, and I struggle with it. And then it either water them too much or not enough, and so it's tough to do grow bags. So I would suggest if anyone's starting off with containers, 5-gallon bucket is what I think is a sweet spot, honestly.
Yeah, I do have quite a few containers as well, in addition to the raised beds. I have 4 of the green stalks, which I'm really enjoying. Like I said, I started off in the self-watering containers. Those got neglected, but I am starting to use them again. I've got a couple of deck railing planters that I put things in, and this year I'm starting a new container garden where I'm using milk crates with smart pot liners. So it's essentially a grow bag garden with a little bit of structure to it. And what I had the same experience as Peter when it comes to grow bags. I like them, but I don't love them. They're really nice for those shoulder seasons, spring and fall, where we're getting ample rain. We've got milder temperatures. But once the heat of summer hits here, they're just anything smaller than, say, 7 gallons, honestly, 10 gallons just takes up way more work than I can handle. But what I will say, I have 2 techniques that I'm deploying when it comes to the grow bags. One is putting some sort of a container that can collect water underneath it. So I've seen people do like kiddie pools. I like the larger plant saucers. So for my 5 to 7 gallon bags, I'll put a plant saucer underneath them. And that way I can sub irrigate the grow bag, meaning add the water to the bottom of the tray and let the water soak up through the grow bag. I found that works really well.
I should try that.
That works great. Sometimes I'll even take my my Gorilla wagon and I'll fill that with water, and then I'll go and just dunk anything that's not in a tray. So every other day, every couple of days, I'll just soak them really, really well, leave them in for like 30 minutes or so, because the soil in grow bags can also go hydrophobic really quick. And what that means is just trying to water it overhead. The water doesn't really penetrate through the soil. It will run through and it'll look like that it's um, watering, but it doesn't soak through. So that's why I like the sub irrigation systems. And the other thing that I'll do is I will do individual drip spikes in each grow bag or in each crate that I'll be using so that I can run a drip line, a main drip line down um, the central point of all the grow containers, and then each one can be watered individually. Like Peter said, in the summers here, that June, July, August period, I have to water daily for even the larger bags, but anything smaller than 5 gallons I found just dries out so quick, and I just don't always have time.
That's a good point about the drip irrigation system, because I just put one in last summer, so I could give him another shot and do the saucer on the bottom, and then drip tube going into each one, and that might make them worth it. We'll see.
What that also does, putting the tray at the bottom, you don't get as much water waste, so that on days where it rains, it doesn't span the entire height of the bag, so you don't have to worry about it flooding because it just holds just enough. But if you do water and you may water a little too much on a day, it'll just stay in the bottom tray and you don't have to worry about wasting the water.
You should keep the nutrients from just like running out of the potting mix too.
Yep.
And keep from staining. If you have it on a patio or deck or things like that, it'll keep it from staining as well.
Yep.
I guess, and you can do all these things with other containers too. You could have a bottom saucer. I don't know how big it would have to be for a 5-gallon bucket, but you could have the drainage holes at the bottom and then on top of something that'll help it bottom water. Same with these totes. Maybe the totes came with some sort of lid that you can flip and use that as some sort of bottom saucer. Yeah, they won't dry out as fast as a grow bag, but they still dry out a lot faster than regular garden soil.
And I've done the kiddie pool, and it's not the most aesthetically pleasing thing, but it really is a nice, convenient way, because you can put a lot of containers in one area, and then it's really easy to just water them. And if it rains, it just collects in the bottom. And actually, I got one of the neighbors was just throwing away. I think it had a crack on the top or something, but it didn't affect the water retention. So, and that's also something, if you go away on vacation, that's another thing to think about with your containers. That kiddie pool, it'll hold a fair bit of water for you to last while you're gone. And then if you can move it somewhere where, probably a lot of your plants, they do want the full sun, but if you're going away on vacation, if they're getting hit with the full sun, the risk of drying out is too great. So you can move them somewhere where they get a little bit of shade from the peak heat of the day, and that'll just kind of help carry them through until you get back.
So one thing we need to talk about is growing in these containers. What do you do when the plants get really big? So tomato plants, how do you trellis them? I guess you could stick a tomato cage probably in a 5-gallon bucket or similar. That might work. Have you seen any other techniques for supporting plants in containers?
I think so. The challenge with the containers is it's kind of twofold. So one is, if the plant gets a little bit top heavy, it doesn't really have a way of anchoring itself in. So it's very susceptible to the wind. And then also when the containers dry out as well, they get really light at the bottom. So again, that can make it really susceptible. So a few points. So again, number one is the larger the container, the more stable it will be against the wind. But I have seen even some pretty reasonably sized containers get thrown around in a bad windstorm. So definitely bear that in mind. And then in terms of securing them, so you could potentially use your deck railings, because the thing is, if you just put your trellis within the container itself, again, if the container is too small or if it dries out, the whole thing is still going to topple over. It doesn't really have that external support. So again, deck railings could be a good option. Or if you have your containers in a part of the garden that you can actually put stakes in the ground, that could be another option. Put in some T-posts into the actual ground to give them stability. Yeah, those are the things that come to mind. But putting the trellis in the container itself could be a little bit risky.
Or like a trellis across multiple containers, if they all keep themselves from falling over, that might help too. Like my friend who had the arch trellis from one set of containers to the other set. And I don't
Mhm.
think they've ever toppled over in the wind. So
One thing I'll add to that is making sure that you're picking varieties that are suitable for container size. That's going to go a long way of helping not need quite as much support. Few examples: micro dwarf or dwarf tomatoes, like I have. Um,
right behind you, right?
Determinate tomatoes, yep, right behind me, growing
Mhm.
indoors. But determinate tomatoes are a much better choice, in my opinion, when it comes to growing in containers than traditional vining crops. Things like Space Master cucumbers, bush beans, um, some of your miniature jalapeno and pepper plants, I find to still produce. I'm not going to say that you're going to get as much produce as you would growing in a raised bed or in ground, but those plants just seem to be a little bit more situated to handle containers.
For sure. That's a great point.
Now,
Any other? Yeah, go on.
what have you all used when it comes to feeding your containers? Because I think
Mm.
that's one thing that there's a lot of back and forth when it comes to granular versus water soluble fertilizer, and then the problem of organic solutions versus synthetic solutions. So, what's been you all's experience with those?
I've done both. The artificial water soluble stuff like Miracle Grow is really good in a pinch. It works fast, but you could easily do too much. So then I usually do a little bit of that and then sprinkle some of the organic granules um, on top, and that's more like long lasting, slower acting.
Mhm.
Um, so if I see a plant struggling, I'll usually do both of those. If it's a, just starting to get some yellow on its leaves, I'll just do the organic granules and skip the artificial stuff. How about you, Aaron?
Well, I have tried both in the past as well. So the challenge with organic methods in containers is organic methods are really relying a lot on the soil biology to break down the organic components into usable compounds for the plant. So it first of all, it takes some time for that to happen, but second of all, it's kind of dependent on having that microbial life, making sure it doesn't die with the soil drying out, and having enough space to make that happen. So it's definitely more challenging to use organic methods in containers. And the thing to think about is a container really is an enclosed system. So it's in some ways it's kind of almost more like a hydroponic type of a thing. Like it's artificial. So um, I think it's kind of, even if you have concerns about organic growing and the environment and that sort of thing, it can be a little bit of a different ball game with the containers. So that's one thing to think about. But that being said, I have had success with just using organic fertilizers. So the pelleted chicken manure, seaweed fertilizers, things like that. Again, that tends to be in larger containers. So a small container, it would still, have a really hard time breaking down those nutrients and retaining them. But in a larger container, I find you can use the organic methods and still have it work. And then some of the other plants, like the herbs, to be honest, I don't really apply a whole ton of fertilizer. They kind of chug along just fine. If I really felt like they were struggling or they needed a top up, again, you could, sprinkle some worm castings or compost, just kind of top it up at the beginning of the season, kind of thing. But the herbs, I do find
Yeah,
they're pretty okay with not having a lot of additional fertilizer.
and they don't live all that long, so you can usually just refresh the soil once they're done, and then be good for the next plantings. Yeah.
Mhm.
I should have
I've
let you
taken a
go
very
first because you have great points about the organic stuff not breaking down in containers. I never really thought about that. Yeah.
I've actually taken a very similar approach to you both. One thing that I do is I do add a very small dose of organic material when I pot out my containers. So a handful of worm casting, a scoop or two of compost, just to give it a little base of some of what Aaron mentioned, that microbial activity. It's not a lot. You can't go ultra heavy with those, but I find that it just gives just enough. And I will also add in some of the granular organic fertilizer. And just like Peter, if I ever see problems, I know it's not ideal, but that's where I come in with the synthetic liquid fertilizer. Now,
Yeah.
the thing
I don't
about
think
it
there's
is
anything
you
wrong
don't
with it.
need,
It's
no, do
you
what
got to
works
do
for
what you
your
got to do.
garden.
So,
Yep.
yeah, everyone
But
gardens
what I
differently. If
will
you want to
say,
stay purely organic, that's okay. There's ways to do it too, but um, yeah, sometimes you
you
kind
got
of
to
Yeah,
do
have
you
what
to.
you
just
got
have
to
to
do.
decide.
Mhm.
Like, is it more important to keep the plant alive and healthy in that case, or is it more important, or you're just like, I'm not worried about it.
Yeah,
I'll just put something else in and freshen up the soil.
yeah, it's your
The
personal
truth of the
preference too.
matter, the plants
Mhm.
don't care where they get the nutrition from. It can be synthetic or organic. They don't care. But what I will say is when it comes to the synthetic, what gets a lot of people in trouble is the dosage, right? So you don't have to go as full strength as what's on the label, especially when it comes to the bigger brands. You can spoon feed, so water at a quarter to a half strength of the liquid synthetic, and your plants you'll see will typically rebound from some of those issues like Peter described.
Hmm. And again, that's a trickier balance in a container, because if you overdo it a little bit in the garden, it has ways of leaching out and dispersing. Whereas in the container, basically you just have to keep water, like flushing it out essentially, to try to get some of that excess out. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky balance.
Extremely.
And if you're growing containers inside and you over fertilize, you can really cause like a fungus gnat issue too. So yeah, I've learned that the hard way. Okay. Uh, is there anything else we should talk about before we wrap this up? Because I think we've covered pretty much everything.
One thing we talked about, our question came from San Francisco. So she's going to have pretty nice temperature, pretty consistent weather, but containers are also highly susceptible to wind. So not just the trellising, but
Mm,
wind can dry out containers just as much as the sun does. So, like Aaron mentioned, you know, a container is it's a microclimate, right? So you're going to need to look if you're in a windy environment, do you have something that can be used as a windbreak but won't also blot out the sun? So
Mhm.
you're just going to have to be very attentive to your environment. The great thing about containers, you can move them around. You can, if you're working
mhm.
from home, you can put it out, in that sunnier spot or that less windy spot earlier on. And then as conditions change, you can move them. So that's one thing that I did want to point out.
For sure. And that's where having the containers that are on casters or wheels can be super helpful as well.
I I just saw one of those and I'm tempted to get one to move my lime tree into
Hmm.
because I feel like it's struggling. It doesn't have enough space, and I could, right now I need to bring it inside because there's a foot of snow outside. So, it won't survive outside in the winter. But if I give it a bigger pot, I won't be able to lift it. But with the wheels, yeah, it might work.
And speaking of winter, that is another key point about containers, is if you are growing anything that's usually a perennial, but you're growing it in a container, at least in the colder climates, you're going to want to take steps to protect that container and protect that plant, because a plant in ground, it still kind of has protection. It has access to moisture. Maybe it's got a nice snow layer on top. So it's kind of nestled in and it's not getting, frostbitten by the wind and things like that. But in a container, again, because there's such little soil to work with, and as Mylan said, it's so susceptible to the wind, your container plants can basically freeze dry over the winter. So it kind of doesn't even matter how hardy they are. If they're in a container, they're very susceptible, especially a smaller container. So you might want to, look at moving any of those perennial herbs or things like that into a protected space. So I
at
find
least
even
next to the house, to cut down on wind.
Yeah, or even an unheated garage, I find works, pretty good. And then you can kind of keep an eye on it as well. Like you don't want the soil to completely dry out. So if you see, it's getting a little bit dry, you can just add that little bit of moisture just to keep it going. You definitely don't want to make it soggy. Other option I've seen is people burying the containers in the ground. So that could be an option, or putting, putting them in a corner and then just bulking up a lot of mulch around the container. That can help just give it that little bit of extra protection as well. But that's definitely something to keep in mind. Like you think, oh, my plant is cold hardy, it'll be fine. But in a container, it's really not the case. So you don't want to be disappointed come the spring.
So before we wrap up, let's talk briefly about just what you mentioned. You come out of winter, you're entering spring, you've got your containers. I know the answer to this, but one, do you throw out your potting mixture soil from your last year's containers, which I know the answer is no. So tell us how you prepare the containers for the next season.
Yeah, personally, I don't really. Again, I would just, if I saw it was sinking a little bit, I'd add a little bit of compost on top just to top it up and keep it fresh. And again, for the larger containers, I do find that the pelletized chicken manure also works really, really well. And some of my containers have been going for a few years now, again, with herbs and things like that. And I find that they don't need too much TLC, but again, just give them, either a little bit of fresh compost, a little bit of a liquid feed with a fertilizer, and just kind of get them set up. And if you are thinking of up potting in the spring, that's a great time as well to add some more, fresh potting mix and things like that.
Yep. Same thing I do, which is like a little bit of compost, basically just some more potting mix and a sprinkle of fertilizer in there, and that's good enough for me. So it seems to work.
So key takeaway there, do not throw away that old potting mix. Is still good. You've still got plenty of value there.
But you think about the things that are in there. The plants don't eat up the peat moss. They don't eat up the vermiculite or the perlite. They don't eat up any of there shouldn't really be any sand, but they won't, so you need to replace the organic stuff that's in there. So that's all that you need to really top it off with.
And all of those resources are age-old resources anyway. It's not like we're inventing new peat moss or cocoa coir each season, so you don't have to treat your containers that way either.
Yep. No, the only thing, you may want to, if you feel like your plant is getting really root bound and you do want it to expand, or you do want to give it more space, then for sure, go ahead, get a new container, get some fresh mix, throw it in, and that kind of thing. But if you're happy with the setup and you're happy with the space and everything, then, just a little refresh should be good to go.
Yep. All right, I think that is a wrap on this episode. Thank you for sending in that question, Roberta. And if you have a question for us, please send us an email at question@planter.garden, and we will make sure to answer it on a future episode of the podcast. You can also ask us on social media too, so either will work. Just if you ask us on social, make sure to say it's for the podcast. And please like, subscribe, hit the thumbs up, leave a review, all that jazz. And we will catch you on the next episode. Goodbye.